The night Yves Delacroix opened his garage door to a stranger. He had exactly $11 in his wallet and a notice from the bank folded in his back pocket that he hadn't been able to throw away. It was the kind of November night that comes to northern Ontario like a punishment. The snow sideways, the wind off the lake mean enough to sting through a wool coat, and the temperature dropping so fast you could feel it moving. Yves had stayed late because the heat at his apartment wasn't working right, and the garage, at least, had the old propane heater in the corner that knocked and rattled but held. He was lying under a '98 Ford F-150 that belonged to a man named Kowalski, who hadn't paid him in 6 weeks, but who Yves kept working for anyway, because Kowalski was 73 and lived alone, and the truck was the only way he got to his dialysis appointments. That's the kind of man Yves Delacroix was, not because anyone had told him to be, just because it was the only version of himself he knew how to be. He heard the knock before he saw anything. 3 hard raps on the corrugated metal door. The kind of knock that isn't polite, that's past polite. That's somebody who has already knocked on too many doors tonight and doesn't have anything left to lose by knocking on one more. Yves slid out from under the truck. He was 31, built close to the ground, with hands that always looked dirty no matter how long he scrubbed them. The grease had worked itself into the lines of his knuckles years ago and stayed there. He'd inherited the garage from his uncle Fernand, who had run it for 40 years before his knees gave out, and Yves had been running it for 6 years since. And in those 6 years he had learned that a knock like that at 11 o'clock at night was never good news. He opened the door. There were 4 of them standing in the snow. Women, all of them, in riding gear that was soaked through. Leather jackets with a patch on the back that said Iron Meridian MC. Bandanas around their necks. Boots that were meant for summer riding. Not this. The one in front was tall, maybe 40, with short silver hair plastered flat against her head and a cut above her eyebrow that had stopped bleeding but left a dark line down her cheek. The one behind her was younger, 20 maybe, and she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. "Our bikes are down the road," the tall one said, "both of them. Ice on the 17. We've been walking 40 minutes. She paused. "She needs to come inside." She meant the young one. Yves looked at them for a moment. He thought about the bank notice in his pocket. He thought about the $11. He thought about the fact that the last time he'd opened this door to a stranger it had cost him a set of tools he'd never gotten back. Then he stepped aside and said, "Come in." Her name was Brigitte Okafor, not the tall one, the young one. She sat down on the wooden stool near the propane heater and pulled her knees to her chest. And Yves got the blanket he kept on the shelf above the oil drums, the one his mother had sent him 3 years ago because she worried, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The tall one's name was Sandra Tremblay. The other 2 were Yves and Lou. He almost said something about sharing a name but didn't, because the room had the particular quiet of people who are grateful but don't know yet if they should be. "What happened to your head?" Yves asked Sandra. "Road," she said. "Not bad. I've had worse." "You want me to look at it?" She looked at him the way people look at someone they've just decided to trust, which is different from the way they look at someone they already trust. More careful, more watching. "If you don't mind," she said. He got the first aid kit from behind the counter, the real one, not the decorative one, and cleaned the cut with antiseptic while Sandra sat very still and didn't make a sound. Brigitte had stopped shaking by then. The other 2, the ones called Yves and Lou, whose real names were Yvonne Bastien and Louise Chartrand, though they'd been going by their road names for so long they sometimes forgot to answer to anything else, were standing near the truck looking at the engine, the way women who know engines look at engines, which is to say quietly and with genuine attention. "Kowalski's fuel injector," Yves said to them, not because they'd asked, but because he could see them wondering. "Number 3? Louise said. "Number 3, he said. She nodded like he'd said something reasonable. "We can help with that if you want. Later. We've got time, I think." He didn't answer right away because he was still focused on Sandra's cut, but he heard it. "We've got time," and understood that they were asking, in the sideways way that people ask when they don't want to impose, whether they could stay. He bandaged Sandra's head and then stood up and looked at all 4 of them and said, "I've got a kettle. I've got tea. I've got," he thought for a moment, "crackers and some peanut butter. That's probably fine." "That's a feast," Sandra said. And she meant it. What Yves didn't tell them, that first hour was that the notice in his pocket was a final notice. Not a warning, not a reminder. Final. The bank had been patient with him for longer than banks are usually patient, because the loan officer, a woman named Cote, who had known Fernand, had pushed for the extension twice already and couldn't push a third time. The garage was mortgaged. Not heavily, not outrageously, but enough that the numbers hadn't worked since the summer, when the highway bypass finally opened and the through traffic that used to stop at the garage dried up to almost nothing. He had until Friday. This was Tuesday night. He hadn't told his mother. He hadn't told anyone. He made the tea and set it on the workbench and found 3 stools and an overturned milk crate, and they all sat. 5 people in a garage in a snowstorm, drinking tea out of mismatched mugs while the propane heater knocked its steady rhythm. Sandra Tremblay, Yves learned, had been riding for 20 years. She'd started the Iron Meridian chapter herself, 8 years ago, in a suburb of Sudbury, where she'd been working as a paramedic and watching people make assumptions about each other at accident scenes. Who deserved help faster, who deserved it slower. Until she'd gotten so tired of it, she'd needed somewhere to put the anger, and motorcycles had been the answer. The chapter had 12 members. They did a winter coat drive every November. They'd been riding to drop off a donation when the storm came up faster than the forecast had said, and the ice had taken the front wheel of Sandra's bike, and then, in the chaos of swerving, Yvonne's too. Brigitte Okafor was the newest member, 22, from Timmins, working at a grocery warehouse on the night shift, saving to go back to school. She'd lost her brother the year before. Not to anything dramatic, just to the slow accumulated weight of things going wrong when you don't have the money to fix them. And she'd been, as she put it, not great for a while. Sandra had pulled her into the chapter, because Sandra had a way of seeing people who were drowning, even when they were standing still and smiling, and because she believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has seen too much to be naive, that the answer to drowning was usually other people. Louise Chartrand was a welder. Yvonne Bastien drove long haul in the summers and spent winters fixing whatever needed fixing, which was everything. They both had the comfortable silence of women who spend a lot of time with machinery and have stopped needing to fill quiet with words. Yves liked them immediately, which surprised him, because he was not a man who liked people immediately. He liked them the way you like people who are exactly what they appear to be. No performance, no angle. Just 4 women sitting in a cold garage being grateful for tea and peanut butter crackers and not making it weird. Around midnight, Louise said, "What's the truck really in for?" He told her. "All of it. The fuel injector." Yes, but also the transmission seal that was going, and the brake line that had a hairline he'd found and fixed for free because he hadn't been able to charge Kowalski for something that would have gotten him killed, and the alternator that was running hot. Louise listened and then said, "We can do the fuel injector tonight, if you've got the part." He had the part. He'd had it for a week, waiting until he felt up to dealing with Kowalski's particular way of standing nearby and offering opinions about the correct way to do things. "You don't have to," Yves said. "I know," Louise said. "I want to. I need to do something with my hands or I'm going to lose my mind sitting in this storm." So they worked. Louise and Yvonne under the hood, Yves handing tools, Sandra keeping Brigitte company near the heater, and occasionally walking over to look and offer observations that turned out to be correct. It was the easiest the garage had felt in months, full of people who knew what they were doing and weren't showing off about it. Around 2 in the morning, with the truck done and the storm still going outside, Brigitte fell asleep on the blanket in the corner. The rest of them sat and didn't feel the need to do anything about the quiet. It was Sandra who asked eventually, not prying, just paying attention the way paramedics pay attention, looking at the thing that isn't being said. "You all right?" she said, to Yves, directly. He thought about saying yes. He said, "Not really, no." He took the notice out of his pocket and unfolded it on the workbench. Sandra read it and passed it to Louise and Yvonne, and they read it too, and nobody said anything immediately, which he appreciated. "Friday," Sandra said, finally. "Friday," he said. "How much?" he told her. It wasn't a dramatic number. It wasn't a number that would mean anything to someone in a different life. But it was his number, the exact measurement of the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. And saying it out loud was the first time he'd said it to anyone, and he felt saying it. The particular exhaustion of having carried something alone for too long. Sandra nodded slowly. She didn't offer solution. She didn't say don't worry or it'll work out or any of the things that people say when they don't know what else to say. She said, "That's a hard thing to be sitting on alone." "Yeah," Yves said, "it is." They talked for another hour. Not about the garage, not about the money, just talked. Louise told a story about a breakdown in northern Manitoba that had involved a moose and a very confused provincial constable. Yvonne was from a small town outside of Rune and had opinions about ice roads that were extensive and funny. Sandra had worked a call once where both parties in a minor collision had ended up helping each other change a tire in the rain and had completely forgotten to be angry by the time she arrived, and it remained her favorite call of 20 years. Around 3:30 they slept, Sandra and Louise and Yvonne on the drop cloths and the blankets that Yves found while he dozed in his chair. The storm kept going outside. The heater kept knocking. The garage smelled of oil and tea and wet leather, and it felt improbably like somewhere people had always gathered. Morning came gray and still. The storm had dropped 1/2 meter overnight and the highway was closed in both directions, which meant nobody was going anywhere. Yves made coffee on the hot plate. Real coffee, because he'd found a can in the back of the cabinet that he'd been saving for nothing in particular. Brigitte woke up and said she was starving, and Sandra laughed and said they all were, and Yvonne somehow produced a bag of granola bars from an inside pocket of her jacket that she said she always kept there, because long haul had taught her that hunger on a schedule was a myth. They ate granola bars and drank coffee and watched the snow settle through the small window above the workbench. Around 9, Sandra's phone worked long enough to get 1 bar and she made a call. She didn't say who she was calling and nobody asked. She was on the phone for about 3 minutes and said mostly numbers, and yes, and I'll send you the address, and hung up. "Bikes should be retrievable by this afternoon, weather permitting," she said. "Got someone with a trailer coming from Sudbury." I've spent the morning doing the work that had been piling up, small things, the things you defer when you're tired and behind, the things that keep a garage actually running. Brigitte asked if there was anything she could do, and he gave her the job of reorganizing the parts shelf, which had been a disaster for 2 years, and she approached it with a systematic focus that suggested she had been looking for exactly this kind of problem to solve. By noon, the shelf looked better than it had since Fernand. Louise found the alternator issue on the F-150 that Yves had mentioned the night before and fixed it without being asked, and then found 2 other small things and fixed those too, and charged him nothing because she said she was using his tools and his parts and his heat, and that was payment enough. Around 2 in the afternoon, a truck came up the road, a big one with a trailer, and a man driving who got out and introduced himself as Petit, who apparently went only by that, and 2 other women from the Iron Meridian chapter who had come to help load the bikes. They were not quiet about their arrival. They came in, assessed the situation, found the coffee, and settled in with the ease of people who are accustomed to showing up to difficult situations and making them manageable. Yves watched his garage fill with people and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the sense that the walls had expanded. Sandra came to stand beside him. She had the bank notice in her hand. She'd picked it up from the workbench. "The chapter has an emergency fund," she said. "Not enormous, but we've used it for members when things go sideways. Sometimes we use it for people who aren't members." She paused. "This is a reasonable amount, Yves, for a reasonable situation that got worse than it should have because the bypass screwed you, and you've been helping people in this town for 6 years and nobody organized anything about it." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for—" "I know you're not asking," she said. "That's why I'm offering." She folded the notice. "The chapter can cover part. The women who came today, they know people. Petit knows the guy who runs the Mechanical Association in Sudbury. There are people in this town who don't know what's happening to this garage and would show up if they knew." "I don't want charity," Yves said, not with anger, just as a statement of fact about himself. "It's not charity," Sandra said. "Charity is when someone decides you deserve help and gives it to you, and you owe them something for deciding. This is," she thought for a moment, "this is just people knowing what's happening and responding to it. Like you responded last night. You didn't decide we deserved to come in. You just opened the door because we needed somewhere to come in. That's all this is." He was quiet for a long moment. The garage was loud around him. Louise and the women loading the bikes onto the trailer. Brigitte explaining her reorganized parts system to one of the newcomers. Petit arguing cheerfully with Yvonne about the best route back to Sudbury in these conditions. Okay, he said finally. It was the hardest word he'd said in months. What happened over the next 48 hours, Yves would later find difficult to explain without it sounding like something he'd made up. Sandra called the Mechanical Association. Petit called 3 people he knew. The Iron Meridian chapter put a message in their network. A woman named Delisle, who ran the hardware store 2 blocks over and had been buying parts from Yves for years without ever saying much, showed up on Wednesday afternoon with an envelope and a casserole and the information that she'd already called the bank and spoken to someone and arranged a conversation, which was a phrase she used with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity to use their connections for something worthwhile. A retired mechanic named Boudreau, who Yves had never met but who had known Fernand, drove down from the reserve an hour north of town and spent the day working beside Yves and told him stories about Fernand that Yves had never heard and that were improbably hilarious. He left without mentioning money at all, and Yves found out later from Delisle that Boudreau had been part of the envelope. The woman from the bank, not the loan officer, someone above her, called on Thursday morning and offered a restructured payment schedule that assumed the garage would still be in business and that Yves would not disappear, which it turned out she had reason to believe, because she had received calls from Sandra Tremblay, from Delisle, from the Mechanical Association, and from 3 private citizens whose names Yves didn't recognize, but who apparently had things to say on his behalf. He cried, on Thursday afternoon, standing alone in the garage, not dramatically, just the quiet, private kind of crying that happens when you've been holding something by yourself for so long, that when people finally take hold of the other end, you feel the weight leave you all at once, and it's too much for your body to process without some kind of release. Brigitte came back on Friday. She wasn't there for any particular reason. The bikes had been recovered. The chapter was long since back in Sudbury, but she'd driven 2 hours in Yvonne's borrowed car because, she said, she'd realized that she had a Saturday free and the parts shelf still had a problem in the back corner that she hadn't finished solving. She worked on the parts shelf and then helped Yves with an oil change for a customer who came in around noon. She was good with customers in a specific way, direct, not performing, saying exactly what the car needed and not embellishing it, and the customer, an older man who was suspicious of everything, left looking satisfied. "You were a paramedic or something?" the man asked her as he was putting on his coat. "No," Brigitte said, "grocery warehouse." The man nodded like this made perfect sense. "Good instincts," he said, and left. Yves watched her close the bay door behind the car and stand for a moment looking at the garage, the organized shelf, the clean workbench, the old propane heater in the corner, with a particular look of someone who is deciding whether a place is somewhere they want to be. "Sandra said you might need someone part-time," Brigitte said, not looking at him, looking at the shelf. "Sandra talks a lot," Yves said. "She does," Brigitte agreed. "She's usually right, though." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the bypass. He thought about the numbers, which were better now but still delicate, a structure that needed tending. He thought about Kowalski and the dialysis appointments, and the fact that he couldn't do everything alone and had been pretending he could. "Monday to Wednesday," he said. "I can't promise more than that right now." "Monday to Wednesday is fine," she said. "I can work around the warehouse until I know what school looks like." "What are you thinking?" "For school." She finally looked at him. "Mechanical engineering, eventually. A long time from now, maybe." "But, yeah, not a long time," Yves said. He was surprised to hear himself say it with that certainty. "You're good, you have the instinct for it. It's not a long time." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." That was Friday. The following spring, Sandra Tremblay came back through town with 6 members of the Iron Meridian chapter on their way to a coast-to-coast run they'd been planning for 3 years. They stopped at Delacroix Garage, which had a new sign, which was Brigitte's idea, and which Yves had resisted for 2 weeks, before conceding that it was correct. And Sandra sat on the same stool, near the same propane heater, and drank the same bad tea and looked around at the place and said, "Better, better." Yves agreed. "Brigitte's enrolled?" "September," he said. "Laurentian. Part-time first. She's keeping the Wednesday shifts." Sandra nodded. She looked at her hands around the mug. "You know, that night, I almost didn't knock. We walked past the garage the first time. I almost kept going." Yves looked at her. What made you come back? She thought about it. The light, she said. The light was on. And I thought, somebody's still up, somebody's still working. That means something. He didn't know what to say to that. He thought about the $11. He thought about the notice, which was in a drawer now, kept not because he was proud of it, but because he thought maybe someday it would be useful to remember what it had felt like to be right at the edge of something and choose to open the door anyway. Outside, the chapter was laughing about something near the bikes, their voices carrying into the garage through the walls, that loose particular sound of people who have learned that the road is better together. The light was on. Yves Delacroix was still working. That meant something.